Starting to record now, and let's go to present. And I'll warn you guys that this one has maybe more than its fair share of rather gross pictures, including the first one that you're going to see. So brace yourself a little bit. It's kind of hard to talk about ascarid nematodes without just a little bit of body horror. Here we are again. We're talking about the order Rhabditida, which includes Tylenchina, Rhabditina, and Spirurina. Spirurina includes 4 big groups of parasites. Ascaridomorpha tend to be large, and they're generally intestinal. Oxyuridomorpha is, the big one there is pinworm, which is probably the most widespread nematode parasite of humans, usually not particularly deadly, but kind of miserable. And then the ones we'll talk about on Monday, Spiruromorpha, includes the filarial worms, the most famous of which would be canine heartworm, and also Wucheria, the worm that causes elephantiasis in humans. And then Gnathostomatomorpha includes dracunculoids, the guinea worms, the one that in 1986 infected 3.6 million people worldwide and is currently down to something like 15. One of the big successes in the fight against neglected tropical disease. Right, so today we'll look at the Ascaridomorpha and the Oxyuridomorpha. And ding. I did warn you guys, that is a bit of resected bowel from someone infected with Ascaris lumbricoides. Ascaris lumbricoides infects between 800 million and 1.25 billion people worldwide. In severe cases, the intestine can be completely blocked, which is a surgical emergency. There are pharmaceutical treatments for it, but if your intestine is blocked, you must have that part of the intestine removed, or you will die. And this is, in fact, what it looks like. Ascarids tend to be some of the largest roundworms. Big females will get up to something on the order of, the ones I've seen have gotten to maybe, I'd say about 5 inches, maybe 10 centimeters, 10 centimeters long. Males are a bit smaller, I think. Ding. And there's our old familiar diagrams from the CDC. The life cycle is pretty simple because transmission is basically fecal-oral. I've tried to come up with a more elegant way of saying that, and I can't really think of any. But eggs pass in feces. They develop outside the body. Infection is transmitted typically through contaminated food. Contaminated water, handshakes with a person who didn't wipe properly, that sort of thing. Fecal-oral transmission. Ding. The wrinkle is that swallowed eggs hatch into larvae, and instead of just cutting straight to the intestine and developing into adults, the larvae actually leave the intestine, travel into the bloodstream, go to the liver, heart, and ultimately to the lungs, and then they're coughed up and swallowed. One of the symptoms of Ascaris infection is a type of pneumonia. When they get to the lungs, they do cause some bleeding, they cause hemorrhage, They cause an irritated response, and they can give you a cough and breathing difficulties that resemble pneumonia. They can also do damage to the liver and to the heart, although I think that's not usually as bad. Once they're coughed up and swallowed, it just struck me that you could stop the progression of the disease by always spitting on the sidewalk instead of swallowing your loogies. I'm not sure I really want to recommend that or not, but back in the intestine is where they mature sexually, they reproduce, they're able to secrete inhibitors that keep them from being digested by the host intestine, and they'll mate, and they'll start cranking out copious numbers of eggs. Ding. Sorry about this. The thing is, the adults are pretty active. They feed primarily on digested food, but they have been known to burrow out of the intestine and penetrate the walls of the intestine, causing abscesses or even peritonitis. They've been known to burrow into the liver. Naturally, they have, you saw one of those knots that blocks the intestine completely. They may fill up the appendix and cause appendicitis. Occasionally, they can migrate up the digestive tract and end up being vomited out, or in some cases, even sneezed out. They have been known to come out the mouth or out the nose of an infected patient. They have also been known to come out the rectum of an infected patient, so they can provide a rather nasty surprise at either end of the digestive system. Ding. Up at the top, you've got a couple of trichuris eggs, the whipworm, and you might remember that those are the ones that are football-shaped and have those transparent plugs at either end. So you've got trichuris at the top. At the bottom, you've got ascaris eggs with this distinctive kind of lumpy all-over appearance. And these happen to be from latrines from Belgium from the Middle Ages, dating to about the year 1300. In these particular latrines, the human waste was so well preserved that it was actually possible to extract bacteriophage virus from it. There's populations of bacteriophages living in the human gut, parasitizing the human gut flora. And yeah, poop is apparently very much full of bacteriophage. And there were some that could be recovered that were 700 years old. I didn't include pictures, but I came across papers looking at the incidence of parasites in well-preserved human feces from the Southwest United States at about the same time, from the Puebloan cultures, roughly the same age as these from Belgium, and they had them too. They had whipworm, they had ascaris, they had a couple of other nematodes, and they even had hymenelepid tapeworms as well. They recovered some eggs that looked an awful like the ones we saw in lab yesterday. So there, you can actually investigate the history of these archaeologically. If memory serves, ascaris also turned up in some Egyptian mummies as well. Dang. We actually know that the Aztecs suffered from ascaris, the natives of what's now central Mexico. And we actually know that this is what they used to cure it. They ate the leaves and drank tea of Chenopodium ambrosioides. Chenopodium is actually a very diverse species. There are some species that are eaten in Europe and North America. There's a species, I forget the Latin name, but the common name is lamb's quarters, that can be eaten. I think it does grow in Arkansas, although I can't think of a time where I've seen it in the wild. Chenopodium seeds are also edible. I believe that's known as amaranth, and you'll see that used sometime as a as kind of a specialty grain. But the leaves of Chenopodium ambrosioides are known as epazote, and they're still used in South Mexican cooking. Although it's not the kind of thing I think you typically find in the average Mexican restaurant in the U.S. I think this, you kind of have to go down there to experience epazote. But it is, there's actually an essential oil in the plant called ascaridid that is a pretty effective deworming agent that kills or makes life miserable for ascaris if you've got it. Ding. That's a section of pig intestine. The human worm is Ascaris lumbricoides, and it's virtually indistinguishable from the pig worm, Ascaris suum. Studies of allele frequencies have shown that lumbricoides and suum don't interbreed. They never or almost never exchange genes. But they seem to be each other's close relatives, and it's a reasonable guess that Ascaris lumbricoides evolved when humans started domesticating pigs and coming into contact with pig feces, and a population of the pig roundworm got established in human populations and has diverged into a separate but very closely related species. So this probably dates to about the time we started domesticating pigs. There's actually a lab I've got a protocol for where I'd have to go to a slaughterhouse and get a pig intestine, because apparently you're just about guaranteed to get Ascaris suum in pig intestines these days. I thought about having you guys dissect one of these, but apparently the fluid inside one of them tends to provoke a very strong allergic response, and this is not something I particularly wanted to deal with. I don't know, maybe I'll try it now that we can do labs without having you physically present. Maybe we'll give it a shot. I don't know. Dang. You vet people might someday encounter Parascaris equorum, close relative of Ascaris, found in horses. That's a bit of horse intestine with quite a lot of Ascaris in it. And apparently, I'm not a horse doctor, but this is notoriously difficult to treat. You need very large doses of medication to cure an affected horse. And of course, if the horse bowel gets blocked, you've got, you know, very serious concern for the horse. Ding. This is the one I was talking about. 70% of adult wild raccoons are infected with another ascarid. This is Balis ascaris procyanus. The eggs are shed in the feces, and unlike Ascaris, Balis ascaris can pass through a paratenic host. The larvae can be transmitted directly to raccoons, or they can enter over 90 species of paratenic hosts, including mice, which may be eaten by raccoons. Raccoons will prey on mice if they get the chance. This is the one I've mentioned before, where human infection is rare. You can get it if you have contact with raccoon feces, which you think no sane person would deliberately want to do, but raccoons tend to return to the same places to defecate night after night. And I'm told this is the kind of thing that you're at risk for if you discover that you've got a family of raccoons living in your attic. That tends to happen. That actually happened to my parents. And you can end up with very large deposits of raccoon poop in your attic. And cleaning that stuff needs hazmat supplies, because if you get larvae, they don't complete their life cycle in you, but the larvae will start burrowing through your body. They'll get kind of lost, and you end up with visceral larva migrans, which is what happens when a larva starts burrowing through your organs. You saw an example yesterday of cutaneous larva migrans where they burrow through your skin. Visceral larva migrans is where they burrow through assorted organs and do some damage. It's particularly bad if you get these in the brain. Ding. Are we having that problem with the lag? The problem we were having where slides weren't changing, but my voice was audible.
It's not so bad today. Like there's a little lag, but your pauses are taking care of it for me anyway.
Okay. All right. Holler if it's a problem for anyone. You're looking at the main ascarid parasite of dogs and cats. These can infect humans, although they're not really supposed to. You can get visceral larval migrans if you get them. There have been cases of kids getting this from playing in sandboxes that the local cats have been using as a restroom. Like Bacillus ascaris, they can be transmitted directly if the eggs are ingested, or you can get them from parotenic hosts. The eggs can infect mice, and then if the cat eats the mouse, they can end up with toxicara. Toxo, by the way, is a word for an arrow, and these are sometimes called arrow-headed worms, and you can see why. That's a close-up of the head of one of these. The mouth is at the very tip, and then you've got a pair of little flanges, little wing-like extensions of the cuticle that make the head look very much like an arrowhead. Vet people, Nick, Abby, you ever see these guys?
I've never seen them look like that in the picture.
Okay. You seen eggs or anything?
Yeah, I think so, on a fecal loop.
Okay. Well, there's a close-up of the head of one of them. You can see you've got that Y-shaped mouth with 3 lips around it. That gut that's Y-shaped in cross-section is typical of nematodes in general. So yeah, you're looking at it, mouth on, and then to either side, you can see those flanges. The technical name for these is alae. Ala happens to be one of the Latin words for a wing. So you have wings or flanges or arrowheads, whatever you want to call them. They're present on Toxicara and Toxoscaris. Ding. Anisakid is probably what we're going to look at in the next lab because they're actually pretty easy to find. These are in a slightly different family from Ascaris as such. This is in the Anisakidae. The adults of Anisakis and this very closely related species called Pseudoterranova, the adults are typically parasites of marine mammals. They'll parasitize whales, dolphins. I should have looked this up. I think they can get into seals and sea lions as well, although I'd want to check that. Eggs, of course, pass out in the feces. They hatch into free-swimming larvae. The larvae get eaten by crustaceans, shrimp and copepods and things like that. Those, in turn, get eaten by fish or squid. And the larvae migrate to the muscle tissue and hang out in the muscle of the fish or the squid. And they can get transmitted from fish to fish, just if one fish eats another fish that's infected. Ultimately, if a fish that's infected gets eaten by a marine mammal, the larvae enter the marine mammal's gut, they molt, and then they develop into adult worms. The adults reproduce, shed their eggs in the feces, and round goes the great circle of life. Humans are susceptible through eating infected fish that are raw or undercooked. They'll hang out in the human gut I believe they can't complete their life cycle there, so they're not permanent residents of the human gut, but they can be pretty miserable for a couple of weeks. Very heavy infections might require surgical intervention. And I now can't think of his name. There was a famous Japanese actor that got a bad case of this from eating sushi. I think eating mackerel sushi specifically. So humans are not the normal host, but it can infect us if we eat raw or undercooked fish. There's something like 1,000 cases of this in Japan every year because they do like their sushi. There have also been cases of it, of people getting this from eating dishes from other cultures, like lomi lomi from Polynesia, or ceviche from Spain or from Chile. These don't prepare the fish enough that they'll kill off anisakis. Pickling or even smoking don't necessarily kill it. Ding. They're actually pretty common in commercially wild-caught fish. And every so often, you'll see a news report of someone who buys fish from Costco or Trader Joe's or Whole Foods, and take out this lovely wild-caught fish fillet, and oh my God, there's a live worm inside. And the person usually freaks out and calls local news, and the supermarket replaces her purchase. And parasitologists everywhere go, yep, it happens. If you eat wild-caught fish, you are likely to get anisakis in there. Now, in America, fish for sushi is supposed to be, it's usually caught out at sea, so it has to be frozen. And it is supposed to be frozen by blasting with liquid nitrogen, which freezes it instantly, much, much more rapidly than sticking it in your freezer would. Putting fish in your freezer is a relatively slow process, and that can actually mess with the texture and quality of the fish. Flash freezing like that and keeping it frozen solid for 72 hours is not supposed to affect the taste or the texture all that much, and kills anisakis. So all of the fish that's served for sushi in the United States is supposed to have been flash frozen, and that should make it safe. You are very unlikely to get anisakis from eating American sushi.
Do they have to freeze this kind of fish as well, or do they just not freeze it till it gets where it's going?
All of the fish I've ever seen sold in Arkansas has been frozen. If you pick up like wild-caught salmon, it will actually say somewhere on the package previously frozen. That's certainly true for Kroger. There are some stores that might make a point of pride of selling fish that has never been frozen. I don't think you're prohibited from selling that. You're just not supposed to serve it as sushi. And then I've got a friend of mine in Washington State who can basically just drive down to the docks and buy her seafood literally right off the boat. So if you're in a coastal area and they're buying extremely fresh fish, it tastes wonderful, but there is a risk that that could have anisakis in it. The answer to which is just cook it. I'm told that fish processors, once they've filleted the fish, if they know anisakis is a potential problem, they'll basically hold the fillet up to an extremely bright light. This is called candling. And you can actually see parasites in the muscle if you've got a bright enough light and a thin enough fillet. And if there are lots of parasites, they'll try to dig them out, or they might even, write it off as unsaleable. So they don't try to sell you fish that are infected with parasites, but realistically, it happens. Life feeds on life. They're there. They're out there. They occasionally do cause distress. Cooking and flash freezing will deal with the problem. Will deal with the problem pretty well. They're not typically something to freak out about too much, but they do happen, and you should try to avoid eating them raw. Fair enough?
That's fair. Thank you.
Okay. Ding. This is what I think I might do in lab next week. Maybe have you guys join in if you're able to do it. First time I taught this course, I brought in some wild-caught Chinook salmon from the fresh from the seafood counter at Bougie Kroger, you know, the one over on Salem. The one on Oak doesn't often have wild-caught Chinook salmon, but Bougie Kroger did. And we were able to dig several of these out. They were dead, be it said, because that fish had been flash frozen and thawed. So the worms were no longer alive, but they were preserved very well. And this is the head of one of them. When you dig it out, you can see the head's got some kind of low bumps on it. There's actually 3, but you can't see all 3 because of the perspective. And the mouth, in this case, I think this is Anisakid simplex, has a little tooth sticking out of it. It's just called the boring tooth, used to dig its way through muscles. So you can see some detail pretty well, even on the dead Anisakis worms that you can sometimes get out of wild-caught Chinook salmon. We found several in Chinook salmon. We didn't find any in the farmed salmon. I don't think we found any in, I know we looked in cod, and I know we looked in redfish, I think, and we did not find any in there, but we only did try it once. So, you know, I might try next week to increase the sample size and dig through some of the local seafood. This is the kind of thing you could do at home. I don't think I'm going to make everybody do that because I'm thinking, Willow, I don't know how much wild-caught seafood you get in Mountain View, Arkansas, but I'm guessing it's probably not a lot.
There's absolutely not. I checked out the store.
Yeah. And I also don't want to make you guys go to the grocery store more often than you absolutely have to, or spend money that you don't absolutely have to. So I might just do this. I might just do this one remotely again. I'm limited in how much data I can gather as one person, but you know, we'll see how it goes. I haven't finalized plans yet. I did bring a microscope and that eyepiece camera home so we can do labs from my house if we have to.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah. So there. Ding. I think this next one might be a little yucky. Oh yeah, that's a Mediterranean herring that in fact was very heavily parasitized. This particular species is sometimes affectionately known as a herring worm, but of course they can infect many species of fish. And as I mentioned, flash freezing will kill the worms. You basically just bomb them with liquid nitrogen right there in the hold of your ship. That's legally required for U.S. sushi. In Japan, it's not, and there's over 1,000 cases a year of anisakiasis. Usually it causes gastric discomfort, but it's not usually lethal. Although it can be pretty bad until the worms finally pass, or so I am told. It's a shame I can't ask him. My wife's dad was a commercial fisherman for a long time and really loved his sushi, as in he used to, you know, never get on the boat unless he had some soy sauce and wasabi with him. You know, he was eating sushi that was, 15 minutes out of the ocean. And I idly wonder if he ever encountered this sort of thing. It's the kind of thing that fishermen and catch processors are very, very used to, but, people that shop at Whole Foods aren't necessarily. Ding. That's all I've got time for with ascarids. I was actually I was going to include one more that you might see in poultry called Heterachus that belongs in this group as well. It used to be a bigger problem than it is if you raise your chickens on wire mesh so that the poop can fall through the holes in the mesh. It's not as much of a problem, but it is something you might encounter if any of you vet people end up working with poultry. Just remember, if your chickens get thrown around and there's nobody doing it, it might be a poultrygeist. That was it. All right. Sorry about that.
That was a bad joke. I'm stealing it, though.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Use it. Sorry, my wife has just walked up.
Yep, sorry.
That's all right. Good morning, sweetie.
Morning.
All right. You missed the really gross pictures.
Good.
Okay.
Did you show him the cat?
Yes, I showed them Jack Wagon.
Okay.
He was not impressed.
He's so cute, though.
Yeah, they did say he was cute. Yeah, you'll probably get to meet all 6 by the time we're done. Anyway, I've said my piece about ascaridomorphs. Oxyuridomorphs. Oxyura means sharp tail. Oxy is sharp and euro is, of course, tail. And oxyurids have evolved this thing that you also find in hymenopteran insects. That's ants, bees, and wasps. And that's haplodiploid sex determination. Females develop from fertilized eggs and they're diploid. Males develop from unfertilized eggs and they're haploid. We didn't see these pictures this year, but these were pictures I took last year of oxyurids in the superfamily called the Thelestomatids. And these are gut parasites of insects and millipedes. These are probably in genus Ladynema. These were the worms that some of you saw in those cockroach guts that we did at the very beginning of this course, if you remember. I don't remember if everybody got them, but a number of people got to see nematodes in their cockroach gut contents. Yes?
Sure, I didn't see it.
Okay. I know some people did. There's a mature female up at the top, and you can actually see her uterus kind of winding through the body, making several bends. An awful lot of what you see is uterus and eggs. She is a mature female. There's a male down there at the bottom, and he is considerably smaller and simpler. Both of them, you can see why they're called oxyurids. They've got this kind of tail extension that's notably more narrow than the rest of the body. So they look like they've got a little sharp pinpoint on the posterior end. And you'll also see this in the main oxyurid nematode that infects humans, one of the more common human parasites. Enterobius vermicularis, the human pinworm. Enterobius infects at least 400 million people worldwide, and it is by far the most common parasite in affluent Western countries. A lot of the parasites that we've talked about tend to thrive in populations in the tropics, sometimes in populations in temperate parts of the world where sanitation is not as good or where human waste is used as fertilizer, things like that. But if you were to census the parasite population of I don't know, the Heights in Little Rock or, Bentonville or something like that, far and away the most common would probably be Enterobius formicularis, the human pinworm. It gets to be that common because it's very easy to spread, but also the effects are relatively mild. It doesn't do anything spectacular like blocking the entire gut, like ascaris would do. In fact, something like a third of all cases may be completely asymptomatic. So it may not be the sort of thing that most people tend to worry about. It doesn't cause obvious distress, and it's also very easy to spread. You're looking at the head of one right there. You can see the gut, and at the front end, there is just a swelling of the cuticle instead of just being nice and narrow and pointy like nematode heads often are. This one has that swollen end that looks, if you're on drugs, like the head of a pin. And then the tail has that distinctive sharp ending, which means that, this thing kind of looks like a pin. The worm looks like a pin if you're taking drugs. Ding. Adults can live throughout the intestines, from the duodenum all the way down to the rectum. They attach to the lining. It's thought that they feed on bacteria and epithelial cells. They're not blood feeders the way that hookworm is. The adults themselves rarely cause symptoms except in rare cases where infestation is extremely heavy. Very occasionally, they might migrate out of the intestine. They can end up in other organs. I was reading about at least one case where pinworms ended up in somebody's ovaries. Yeah, not fun. They can sometimes infect the female genitalia, causing itching and general unpleasantness. And I'm kind of sorry I mentioned that, but there it is. So occasionally they'll migrate to other organs, but in the gut themselves, they usually don't cause symptoms unless you've got extremely high numbers of them. Where they cause symptoms is when they reproduce. The males die very soon after mating. Impregnated females start migrating down the intestine, and they end up crawling out of the anus. And yes, that is a close-up of a human anus with a lot of pinworms surrounding it. And they will lay eggs on the folds of skin surrounding the anus, the perianal folds. A single female can lay up to, I think, over 16,000 eggs. They die fairly soon after egg laying. Eggs can be passed in the feces, and they can be transmitted through the fecal-oral route. I think I'm going to make this picture go away. But they're also spread because perianal itching, the itching of the skin around the anus, encourages people to scratch, especially kids. The eggs will get picked up on the fingers. And they can be spread through any sort of contact. Eggs can be transmitted through clothing because you get them on your pants. They're light enough that they can be spread by airborne dust. I remember reading that they have been found in samples of dust taken from elementary schools. They can get, on curtains and things like that, or anything that somebody scratches. This, by the way, is what they look like. On the right, you've got freshly laid eggs. On the left, you've got more mature eggs, and that folded thing inside that makes the eggs look like coffee beans. That's actually a baby nematode forming, kind of coiled up inside the egg. Eggs will also sometimes hatch on the perianal folds. They can take, in warm, moist conditions, they can hatch within 6 hours of being laid. And especially if you don't, wipe often enough, the larvae that hatch from the eggs can crawl back into the large intestine. So this is another worm that can auto-infect, that can infect the same individual host repeatedly. Certainly they can cause distress with perianal itching. They can cause secondary problems to that, like loss of sleep, general psychological trauma, in little kids that may not have the fortitude to put up with this or be able to explain what's wrong. They can cause other psychological symptoms like bedwetting and things like that. Clearly, they're not something that you really want to get if you can avoid it. But we've had them from the very beginning of humanity. The closest relatives of human pinworm is chimpanzee pinworm, suggesting that our common ancestor between chimps and humans also had pinworm. So there. And that would seem to be the end of the show. On Monday, there we go. Sorry, Willow, you're looking a little bit grossed out. Sorry if some of those were, yeah, some of those were a little dodgy. I freely admit.
It's like it was gross. You even warned in the email that it was going to be gross. But
Yep. Well, you know, it's parasitology. It takes guts to study parasites. Get it? I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. Oh, there.